This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Welcome to Close Reads. We are starting another series. This time, to supplement our partially examined life coverage, we've been doing Marxism, Karl Marx, Feuerbach, Max Stirner, and now a lot more Marx. And we got the interaction between Marx and Feuerbach pretty well, but what we did not get very well at all was what Marx had to actually say about Stirner, because that was contained in a text called The German Ideology, which we covered back in episode 70 in 2013. Oh my gosh, so long ago. And of course, we didn't read the parts that were about Stirner in there because we'd not read Stirner. We didn't know anything about Stirner. No reason we should have read that. But apparently the length of what he wrote, of what Marx wrote in that book about Stirner, is longer than the Stirner book, The Ego and Its Own. So we thought we'd take a piece of that. So that's, again, Marx from 1846. And we're going to go to, it's the section on Saint Max. We'll send out a link. It's page 259 or PDF page 255. We're sort of just, he'd started more than 100 pages ago, but we just had to pick something. Apparently he starts by like going through the whole Bible somehow, Marx does, and evaluating.
No, I think those are just metaphors.
Okay. I'd only looked at it for a second.
Yeah, no. He's just like how he's calling him Saint Max.
Mm-hmm.
This is just like a page by page critique of The Ego and Its Own by Stirner. Like it's a commentary.
Mm-hmm.
So he's going bit by bit through it, and all the sections match up with, as far as I can tell, with what's in The Ego and Its Own. And but he's giving clever titles to parts of it, like Genesis, for the historical beginning of the historical part. And yeah.
So I have gotten a sense, I did not appear on the Stirner episode, but I did an editing pass on it. I enjoyed what you guys had to say about it. It seemed like one that it was okay that I missed, that I did not read him. But then we got a couple emails saying, oh, you guys are giving this guy short shrift. It's actually a pretty significant challenge to think about what happens to normativity, what happens to values when you get rid of the idea that there is a social point of view and a intersubjective or objective point of view to validate, to argue for values, which to me, this brings to mind more Kierkegaard, right? In Fear and Trembling, this guy Abraham is faced with this, even though it's a religious parable. It's not like Stirner, who is very anti-religious, but still I have some sort of normative, a call on me to do this thing that I cannot explain to anybody. Maybe because we're each in our own unique situation, we can sort of have some solidarity that we're each unique, but Kierkegaard even denies that, so that we just literally sound. So it seems like that this is thinking through, Nietzsche's project of once we get rid of God as the basis for morality, how do we change our thinking about morality? It can't be that there are laws of morality. So it seems like Stirner is trying to think in a very serious way, according to this emailer at least, about what happens when we get rid of, can we have values, can we have, that we can't justify. So this guy said, I don't know if this is something Stirner explicitly says, but that the ego, the locus of value for the true individual, is like the Tao. It can never be spoken, right? Because once you speak it, it's a concept. It connects to other people's conception of their value. So it's no longer the unique. You've by putting it into language, you've falsified it.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find that? I don't know if you even looked at that email.
I don't think I saw that email.
Oh, okay. I feel like we've gotten a couple. There was one that was saying, there's another text in which Stirner defends himself, called Stirner and His Critics. That would be where he's a little maybe more systematic in a way that you folks on the podcast would have liked him to be. So I'd consider that for here, but this is just a more obvious gap. We're not Stirner fanatics. I don't know. I could see at least there's a very small contingent of people who are way into Stirner in a way that, they were like, oh, you guys, that's a natural sort of first take that you had on him, but just dismissing him as proto Ayn Rand, which of course, that's very insulting toward anybody, because the notion of, as this emailer pointed out, that Ayn Rand had an ethics, right? It's the virtue of selfishness. So you could actually argue for selfishness, whereas there's an inconsistency there because, again, values imply argument. I'm thinking sort of this Rortian, a community of value. Even if we say, well, what I'm obligated to do has more to do with my particular interests and the things that I value, right? We don't have to be utilitarians and say my life to me has to be of equal value of your life to me, right? I'm just treating everybody the same. We could say we all have specific duties toward ourselves and the things that we value, but that's still an ethics. It's still something that I can explain to you that you can understand. That's why Ayn Rand said it's objective. It's not merely, your subjective whim, but I think Stirner is trying to take the more difficult route of biting the bullet and saying, yeah, if values are merely generated by the self and really there's no social or objective thing that I can refer to, can I even call that an ethics? Yeah. All right. Any other introduction? Right. Obviously, since I wasn't on that episode, I have a burst of things to say. And in fact, I even started listening to the audiobook of Stirner after the fact, just because I wanted a flavor of the prose to see, what is life without something that is transcendent. Like, it seems, at least the way it starts, it's sort of anti-Platonist. That's what all value systems. So in that sense, he's just doing, what Nietzsche did. Can we live in a life without appeal?
Yeah. So instead of appealing to human nature, what appeals to the unique individual, or as a source of valuation. So, not to Max Stirner insofar as he is human, that's not the source of values, but to Stirner himself. And ultimately, Marx will think that's just another abstraction that doesn't go far enough, and more importantly, it doesn't recognize our interdependence with individuals within a society. And his understanding of power doesn't reflect an understanding of class struggle and material conditions and all that stuff. So the overall arc of this is, we're just going to read a tiny snippet today, but it's the sorts of things you could expect. You would expect very, very typical Marxist critiques of these themes in Stirner. But the one thing to keep in mind is, again, it's the same sort of critique that each one makes against his predecessor, right? Stirner's doesn't like human nature, and now Marx doesn't like Stirner nature. Neither of them is concrete enough.
And it seems like it may be stuck with Marx. I mean, can we call Marx a humanist? I know this is an issue like with existentialism that Heidegger maybe didn't like to consider what he was doing in humanism. Sartre argues, yes, existentialism is a humanism, but you have to understand that in a very peculiar way, because humanism might say, instead of the values being in the sky with God, with some foreign to humanity thing, as Rorty would put it. Yes, that's the quote from Rorty. Foreign to humanity thing. The inhuman, it lies in human nature itself. So what is valuable in us, seems like Kant is this kind of humanist, is something that we all share in common that the animals and the environment and the other things you might want to value do not have. Whereas, and even Feuerbach is definitely that kind of humanist, seemingly, right? That what we do
Yeah.
theologically is in fact worshiping humanity, is worshiping what is best in human, and the telos and the ideals built into what it is to be human.
And Sartre, by the way, in that essay, it's very contradictory with his position, and he ends up sounding just like a humanist and not like an existentialist, right? Where we don't simply pull values. It's not a matter just of radically free positing of our own values. He seems to back off that, and the existentialism is a humanism, and admits that there's something about values are predicated on the human, on something we can say in general about human beings. So I've never seen Sartre as very consistent with that, and that I don't think there's much that as far as, and readers listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know how you defend that point of view. I don't know how you defend Stirner's point of view. It's I'm sure people have written in think there are sophisticated ways to defend this that are consistent, but I don't know how you do that. So it would be interesting to find out if there is a sophisticated way to do that. But
all right, to wrap up the longest intro we've ever had on this podcast, please give us go iTunes, give us 5 stars, or Apple Podcasts as they call it now. We are just to refresh people how this works. I still had I post this on the Partially Examined Life site, maybe in the PEL Patreon $5 feed, and people are like, "Well, when's part 2 coming out?" Well, part 2 is only available if you subscribe via our Close Reads Patreon, patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy, or if you're at the $10 level right now on our Partially Examined Life feed. So you might have to upgrade that. So yes, this is an additional service. This is an additional upgrade. So if we record a second or third session on this, that's the only way you're going to hear it. And there's, so you'll get twice or 3 times as much content as you're getting on the public feed if you just jump on even for a month and pay us for that, and you can download them all however you want to do it. But we hope you will support the effort. Thanks so much for listening. Let's get going. So we're on yes, you want to read the heading there that you chose?
The phenomenology of the egoist in agreement with himself with the theory of justification. As we have already seen in the economy of the Old Testament, which is his right, that this is his retitling of a section in Stirner's book, so he's referring to something that comes prior to this in his commentary. As we've already seen in the economy of the Old Testament and afterwards, Saint Sancho's true egoist.
Sancho Panza, but I don't.
Right. I don't know at what point Saint Max became Saint Sancho, but he's trying to insult him as a lackey, basically, as a Don Quixote's sidekick. Saint Sancho's true egoist, in agreement with himself, must on no account be confused with the trivial, everyday egoist, the egoist in the ordinary sense. Rather, he has as his presupposition both this latter, the one enthralled to the world of things, child, Negro, ancient, etc., and the selfless egoist, the one enthralled to the world of thoughts, youth, Mongol, modern, etc. It is, however, part of the nature of the secrets of the unique that this antithesis and the negative unity which follows from it, the egoist in agreement with himself, can be examined only now in the New Testament.
So do we remember what he had to say about, what Stirner had to say about why it's not regular egoism? I know you have to have some sort of enlightenment, right? You have to have some sort of self-awareness, whereas just in an animalistic way, following your needs, yeah, okay, that's a form of egoism, but it's not being aware that you're being egoistic. And then he was referring to the selfless egoist. I could at least imagine what kind of argument that would be, that even people who pride themselves on being so selfless. Well, they're actually doing that because it makes them feel good, right? It's the criticism that everybody's actually selfish, even those who pretend to not be, because they're doing that out of satisfaction to themselves, but they're doing it in a hypocritical way.
Yeah, I don't know that we read enough of Stirner to figure out how this differs from regular egoism. It wasn't. I don't think it was clear to me from the reading how you distinguish it from regular egoism. So he's, here in this paragraph, all of this, by the way, is very vitriolic and sarcastic and nasty. The entire commentary, cranky. It just drips with this. So the fact that he's comparing this movement from Old Testament, right? Just even there's a retitling of things as a movement from Old Testament to New Testament. He's trying to suggest that Stirner is really still in the thrall of religion, even though he thinks it isn't. Right, he's using this metaphor of the New Testament to suggest that it's the way that we're going to understand this special sense of egoism, and it sort of parallels, right? So the movement of the actual New Testament is a movement from it towards love, right? From the law and maybe a wrathful God, right? But from the law to love, and now we're getting a movement here from ordinary egoism to egoism in this special Stirner sense, which I think hopefully we'll find out a little bit about what that is from Marx's critique if he's honest and non-cranky enough to actually give it. He's just going to be making fun of it, but we'll see what that reveals.
Yes, the thing I was saying about Kierkegaard before was presaged by what we read about Hegel talking about the Christian advantage over Judaism, that Judaism really is, let's refer to the objective law. That's what ethics is. Whereas by introducing love, then things become a little more freeform, a little more reliant on you as the individual, or the individuals in the relationship, at least, your judgment of what constitutes ethical action, right? Is it filled with love or not? Like, it either, that's not something you could necessarily judge from the outside. Let me just keep going. Since St. Max wishes to present the true egoist as something quite new, is the goal of all preceding history, he must, on the one hand, prove to the selfless, the advocates of dévouement, that they are egoists against their will. And he must prove to the egoists in the ordinary sense that they are selfless, that they are not true, holy egoists. Let us begin with the first, with the selfless. Okay, so we're going to see whether I was right in this, I actually quite Ayn Randian take down of selflessness, that you people that think you're selfless, first you're just being confused because you're not identifying what your needs really, what your values, where your values should be pointed. But then also they are referring to the self in a way that you, the selfless, would deny.
Well, regular egoism assumes human nature, right? It says, well, because we are the way we are, we have these certain interests, and advocates self-interest in the sense of the human interest, of what a human being would be interested in. And Stirner is going to argue for Stirner's interest, right? This radical uniqueness. So again, lots of commonality with existentialism, positing one's own values based on one's individual character. You see this in Nietzsche as well, becoming what you are, as opposed to positing values that are based on abstract human nature. And so that's what Marx is getting at here.
Yes, and this egoist in agreement with himself makes me think of like the Wittgenstein private language argument thing, which would be an argument against just relying on, oh, value is not a public thing. It's not, the way that Kierkegaard characterizes Hegel, which is value refers to the community standards. And if I, as the individual, if he's going to say chosen by God, he's saying it in the Feuerbachian sense, where I'm actually, it's my uniqueness, it's my ownness that I'm externalizing, and I'm saying I have a specific calling. So it's like Socrates' demon or something. I mean, Socrates thinks that actually that's the objective world of the forms that's calling him, but his experiences of it is of this individual thing that ultimately he can tell people that he has this voice in his head, but they're not going to then say, oh, tell me more what the voice in your head says. Like they're not going to listen to him. It's not, you can't use it as a justificatory scheme. So if you get rid of the Feuerbachian Kierkegaardian self-alienation, I'm going to put God outside myself and just say, the value is in me. I just am recognizing that, but yet there's a unique thing. Then how do you keep track of that? That as Wittgenstein points out, if you have just a private word for one of your individual emotions, how do you know that that's going to keep the same referent over time? You don't have anybody to correct you if you get it wrong. Your emotion could just very slowly change over time, or the concept could just slowly change over time and you wouldn't know. So maybe there's something self-contradictory about the idea of a value or any other concept that is just specific to you.
All right. We have already seen countless times that in the world of Jacques Le Bonheur, happy Jack, I guess, everyone is obsessed by the holy. Nevertheless, it makes a difference whether one is educated or uneducated. He's quoting there, and I assume he's quoting Stirner. The educated, who are occupied with pure thought, confront us here as obsessed by the holy par excellence. They are the selfless in their practical guise. And now he seems to quote Stirner at length. Who then is selfless completely? Most likely, and Marx is putting, I think, inserting his own exclamation points here. He who stakes, so it's completely, exclamation point, most, double exclamation point, likely, triple exclamation point, just Marx's insertions. He who stakes everything else on one thing, one aim, one purpose, one passion. He is ruled by a passion to which he sacrifices all others. We read this out loud actually during our PEL episode and noted the similarity here to Nietzsche. And are these selfless not selfish, perhaps? Since they possess only a single ruling passion, they are concerned only with a single dissatisfaction.
There's no dissatisfaction.
Sorry, with a single satisfaction, but the more ardently on that account. All their deeds and actions are egoistic, but it is a one-sided, concealed, narrow egoism. It is obsession.
So asceticism for Nietzsche, right? That if you hone your interest to even I'm going to serve the public good or something like that, I'm going to be Mother Teresa, then you are, for Nietzsche, he just says it's a will, not that's egoistic, but it's a will to power, which of course, it's an expression of personal power. It's not roping the objective power of Schopenhauer, something external. It is very personal.
So instead of saying we have drives, we have eros, and it's in conflict with rationality, nous or logos, and rationality overcomes the drive, overcomes the desire. Really, you're just pitting different drives or passions against each other, and one wins, so that you can recast asceticism and self-denial and what would normally look like the rule of reason over desire. You can recast that as just one form of desire winning out over another form of desire, so that's the way Stirner is characterizing this. And this turns out to be a one-sided, concealed, narrow egoism and is an obsession. So, I mean, there's two critiques there, which is that he's reducing so-called selflessness to egoism. And the second critique is that it's not the right type of egoism. It's not the Stirner's enlightened egoism. It's obsession.
Hence, according to St. Sancho, they possess only a single ruling passion. Ought they to be concerned also with the passions which not they but others possess, in order to rise to an all-round, unconcealed, unrestricted egoism, in order to correspond to this alien scale of holy egoism? Let me just keep going. In this passage are incidentally introduced also the miser and the pleasure seeker, probably because Stirner thinks that he seeks pleasure as such, holy pleasure, and not all sorts of real pleasures. As also, quote, Robespierre, for example, Saint Just, and so on, as example of selfless, obsessed egoists. This is all still quoting. From a certain moral point of view, it is argued, i.e. our holy egoist in agreement with himself, argues from his own point of view in extreme disagreement with himself, approximately as follows, quote, but if I sacrifice other passions to one passion, I still do not thereby sacrifice myself to this passion. I do not sacrifice anything thanks to which I am truly I myself.
So when he's calling, he's talking about holy egoism. This is not the way Stirner characterizes it. So this is part of his whole theme of comparing Stirner to a saint, and his book sections to testaments, because he wants to say there's something still quasi-religious about it. So, in other words, the unrestricted egoism, he's going to say is still, which is Stirner's egoism, he's going to say is still subject to something alien, right? Which is the critique of Feuerbach, that's there in Stirner as well, right? So the alien thing would be human nature that stands over us. So ought they to be concerned also with the passions which not they but others possess, in order to rise to an unrestricted egoism, in order to correspond to this alien scale of holy egoism. So I don't know what the critique is there, except that.
Yeah, is he criticizing the supposed hypocritical, selfless people? They possess only a single passion. They should actually understand this as a form, a breed of egoism. And he's saying, ought they to be concerned, Marx is saying, ought they to be concerned also with the passions which not they, but others possess? I don't understand. Is it, in other words, to make Stirner's theory consistent, he should analyze these supposedly selfless people as being, I'm not just going to...
he might be paraphrasing Stirner here, actually.
Okay.
So according to St. Sancho, they possess only a single ruling passion. So now it's unclear whether it's Marx's critique or he's just paraphrasing.
Right, there's just
Stirner
a semicolon.
Still. Yeah. But let's assume for a second that he's just continuing to paraphrase Stirner. Ought they to be concerned also with the passions which not they but others possess? In other words, hey, you are, you, the selfless one, are ruled by this passion of selflessness, which turns out to be a very egoistic passion. What about other people who don't share your altruism, who don't want to be ascetic? Why not consider their passions? Only then would you rise to this unrestricted egoism. Okay, so and this holy egoism. In other words, you can't be truly selfless unless you admit some sympathy with the selfishness of others.
Right, I understand.
So it does sound like a paraphrase of Stirner's critique. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, that doesn't sound, from what I understood, that Stirner's right? Stirner's ideal would be that you don't pay attention to what other people want, right? That's what they want is getting in the way of you understanding your
Well,
own
he's just pointing to a
authentic
contradiction
desires.
in the
Okay,
altruist's position. Yeah.
sure.
Um,
Right. So like, if you're completely liberal, you're completely accommodating and tolerant, then you have to tolerate intolerance. And so the complete tolerance blows itself up. Well, complete
similar type of thing. Yeah.
egolessness would mean letting other people's desire, oh, what can I do for you? What can I'm so selfless. I want to serve you. Well, what if the person that I'm trying to serve is a selfish piece of crap? Then I ended up being their henchman.
Yeah, and this is an argument which I'm somewhat sympathetic to because as I've said before, I think the ethical requires some sympathy with the selfishness of others, with the self-interestedness of others. I don't think we can do without that, right? If others didn't value themselves and their own lives in this special
Hmm.
way, I think some of our empathy with that would lose its force, right? It'd be hard to empathize with someone who didn't care about dying, for instance, for whom dying was just as the same sort of they felt the same way about it as having a cup of coffee in the morning or something like that. So there has to be this kind of self-returning vector of self-interest on those little nodes out there, those people that were going to empathize with us in order for our vector of empathy to actually reach out to them. It's got to grab onto that. So I think there's something. It's not the same argument, but there's a little bit of overlap here because all Stirner is really trying to do is say, hey, this is self-contradictory. You say you're altruistic, but really you're just concerned with your obsession with asceticism to the point where you don't even empathize with people's self-interest. You pretend, and if you're not empathizing with people's self-interest, then how can you be fully altruistic? And then, okay, so what's he saying next here? The pleasure seeker and the miser. Examples of so
Selfless, obsessed egoists.
selfless, obsessed egoists.
I mean, I think it's just focusing on one thing. So what Nietzsche called asceticism, but ironically, that clearly is not the right word to use for Stirner's version of it. If a singular focus on achieving physical pleasure, and the Don Juan ends up being that's my thing. It is selfless in a way. All these are just a case of the serious man. I mean, it's silly to think about Beauvoir giving an example of the serious man as the Don Juan. In fact, she has her own, that's the adventurer. That's something else in her scheme. But yes, when you, as this quote says, when you sacrifice yourself to the singular passion, then you are
Yeah,
existentially making a boo-boo.
exactly. Yeah. So there's, the miser who I think of like George Eliot's Silas Marner, which we were all forced to read in high school at one point. She's great, by the way. I don't want to say forced, but the sense of self neglect that comes along with that, right? I'm acquiring and storing all this gold, and presumably that's me attending to myself. But really, I'm wretched. I'm ignoring my own soul and social relationships. One could say something very similar about philosophy, by the way, or any obsession.
Yeah.
Being a musician, getting so involved in it that you're not really attending to your own good. And of course, the same with the pleasure seeker. That's a very classic kind of critique of pleasure seeking, which is that you are losing sight of your own good and not attending to it. And therefore, that's quote unquote selfless in that sense. And I think Stirner, above and beyond that, right? These are aspects of the human nature conception of what self-interest is. So anything that puts us in a relationship to these human nature qualities of seeking pleasure, for instance, is really a subordination to the self in the true unique sense, living up to Westness, let's say, as opposed to living up to my pleasure seeking human nature. I'm selfless in the sense that I subordinate that truer, unique self to the self in general, still evocative of essence. So, and you could say the same thing about, well, he says Robespierre, another selfless, obsessed egoist. Again, this is a
I mean, he's a fanatic.
paraphrasing Stirner. Yep. From a certain point of moral point of view, it is argued. He's quoting Stirner here. I still do not thereby sacrifice myself to this passion. I do not sacrifice anything thanks to which I am truly I myself. So the Stirner version of egoism does not make the same sort of sacrifice to it, this
Yep.
external alien passion.
All right, you want to keep going? He's going to say a little more about Robespierre here.
Saint Max is compelled by these two propositions in disagreement with each other to make the paltry distinction that one may well sacrifice six, for example, or seven, and so on, passions to a single other passion without ceasing to be truly I myself, but by no means 10 passions, or still a greater number. This is Marx's sarcastic critique. Of course, neither Robespierre nor Saint Just was truly I myself, just as neither was truly man, but they were truly Robespierre and Saint Just, those unique, incomparable individuals. So I don't know what the critique here is yet. I should probably read the next one as well.
Sure.
Go ahead.
The trick to proving to the selfless that they are egoists is an old dodge, sufficiently exploited already by Helvetius and Bentham. St. Sancho's own trick consists in the transformation of egoists in the ordinary sense, the bourgeois, into non-egoists. Helvetius and Bentham, at any rate, prove to the bourgeois that by their narrow-mindedness they in practice harm themselves. But St. Max's own trick consists in proving that they do not correspond to the ideal, the concept, the essence, the calling, etc., of the egoist, and that their attitude towards themselves is not that of absolute negation. Here again he has in mind only his German petty bourgeois. Let us point out incidentally that whereas on page 99 our saint makes the miser figure as a selfless egoist, on page 78, on the other hand, the avaricious one is included among egoists in the ordinary sense, among the impure, unholy.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's okay. So he's comparing the more traditional critique, which I've already summarized, about trying to show to the selfless that they are egoists. And trying to show to egoists in the ordinary, right? So, all right, what's the traditional way? What he calls an old dodge. Let's make this contrast. Try to make this contrast clear.
I thought it was what I said. Which is you think you're so selfless, but you just are doing that out of a passion for selflessness. You do that because it makes you happy. That is your form of selfishness. So that's the regular.
Right, but you, yeah, in particular, yeah, I'm just trying to think about how this pivots off of the distinction between the good and pleasure seeking. So I think what he wants to say is that the first critique is still appealing to human nature, but Saint Max's trick. So one way to prove to people who think that they're selfless that they're really selfish is to say, well, I don't know. Yeah, I'm a little bit unsure here. I'm trying to get at this contrast. Saint Max's own trick, which is supposed to be different, right, from what just came before, is to talk about not living up to the egoist in Stirner's sense, which involves this attitude of absolute negation.
Which the egoist, the selfless, the person that claims to be selfless, is not going to find this. Why would they find that convincing? Like Max says to them, "You're not actually egoistic in my sense," and they say, "Well, yeah, I'm not egoistic in any sense. What are you even talking about?" So I don't think we're getting this yet. Proving that they do
Um,
not correspond to the ideal, the concept, the essence, the calling of the. I mean, you'd have to show that they are in fact being hypocritical, that they are. Yeah, it's got to be some different kind of hypocrisy. You think you are selfless. In fact, you're just doing that because, if we imagine Bentham giving this argument, because it gives you more pleasure to act in a way that is apparently selfless, that apparently harms yourself, but it actually is giving you more pleasure. So in fact, is benefiting yourself. So what's the alternative? Another chart of hypocrisy, or do you deny that is the alternative? Is
yeah, this is unclear to me so far. Right. So the attitude of absolute negation is associated with egoism in Stirner's sense. Sorry, absolute negation. Not did I say self negation? Absolute negation. Well, it is self negation because it's an attitude towards oneself.
is that Stirner's goal? Is to have absolute negation because what remains, if I negate everything else, if I'm a nihilist, is the ego, and that is what I'm promoting explicitly.
Yeah. The problem is that there's this double conception of self. There's self in the general sense, right? So the human nature sense, which Stirner does want to negate, but there's self in the unique sense, which I think we embrace.
Hmm.
We don't want to be subject, in other words, to any external standard.
Sure.
We want to be absolutely free. That's Stirner's shtick. But how do we do that? This is just me talking now, not Marx. How do we can say, right, I'm going to live up to Westness and not godliness and not human nature, reject those alien standards. But one might say, well, isn't Westness an external standard in a sense as well? Is there, right? So maybe that's what the critique that Marx is going to repeat here.
Yeah, certainly what you would, if you want to be all that you can be, reflect on what you really want. Well, where did you get those wants? And I think Marx is going to say that all your
That's a good
wants
point.
are inauthentic, that you've gotten them from society. So if you're like, I want to be the best West that I could be, and that means being the best philosopher, that means having self-respect, that means doing things with my day that are not tedious or whatever, certainly you were involved in deciding that those things were valuable, but you did not come up with them whole cloth. They do not reflect your uniqueness. In fact, probably a lot of people would want those exact same things.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Marx is going to say, from what I understand of the overall project, right, that a lot of these, like what we are, is determined by our social relations, which is in turn determined by material relations, including economic conditions. So he wants to emphasize this the role of social influence and cultural influence in making us what we are. So when I talk about Westness, I didn't just pull Westness out of my ass. It was handed to me, and some of it's individual and about temperament, but a lot of it is about it's a concatenation of different social influences. Yeah, I may be unique. I may have a unique thumbprint in a sense because of the way those different influences are arranged in me. But there's nothing unique about an interest in philosophy, for instance, if I take any one of those influences by itself. And unless I come to terms with the with that and the kind of alien origin of my own character, right, through external influence, I haven't really done much, maybe, according to Marx's critique. All right, I forget whose turn it is to read.
It's uh, it's yours.
Did you want to say something?
I'm not sure I understand why he's pointing out here he has in mind only his German petty bourgeois, right? That he is right. That the petty bourgeois think that they are generous and Christian, and they're full of it because they're actually. I mean, we can think of lots of reasons, right? And Marx is going to agree with some of these reasons that you give to the poor at Christmas time, and you have general goodwill toward your fellow men, but your basic relation to the world is one which you're participating in exploitative exercise. So just, we in our comfortable Western liberal democracies now are relying on exploited labor in other countries to have our cheap goods that makes our lives. So that moral stain more than ruins any goodwill that we might have, any goodness that we think we've developed, any selflessness by being a generally friendly person in our social relations.
I mean, this is a typical Marx move. He wants to say, you think you're talking about economic laws in general, or you're just talking about capitalism. You think you're talking about human nature, you're just talking about bourgeois nature. So here, I think the idea is you're trying to send up the hypocrisy of people who claim to be selfless, or the self-contradiction in that. Well, you're only talking about the bourgeoisie. So maybe Marx thinks selflessness is possible in some important sense that Stirner doesn't.
So the bit that I thought, in just listening to some of the actual Stirner book this morning, that was, I thought one of Stirner's main points was to try to think through clearly what a non-transcendent, what a non-alienated, so in other words, you don't bring up an ideal, you don't bring up a calling. Mm-hmm. So even having your agreement with yourself, having sort of this ideal of egoism that is free from the taint of social contamination, then that in itself is still self-alienating, right? Is that part of Marx's critique of Stirner, that Stirner, you think you've gotten rid of the idea of transcendence, but by saying that, well, there's a right way to be an egoist and there's a wrong way to be an egoist, you're already retaining there being an ideal, something to aim for. And as soon as there's something to aim for, even if it's I want to be the best Wes I can be, then isn't that against the spirit of Stirner's whole enterprise, which is get rid of these ideals, get the whole idea of an ideal is foreign, is alien.
Yeah, good point.
The second, are we at the second class?
Mm-hmm.
The second class of the hitherto existing egoists is defined on page 99 as follows. These people, the bourgeois, are therefore not selfless, not inspired, not ideal, not consistent, not enthusiasts. They are egoists in the ordinary sense, selfish people thinking of their own advantage, sober, calculating, etc.
So, yeah, the bourgeois is Marx's interpolation here, right? These people.
Mm-hmm.
Marx wants to say in parentheses. You really mean the bourgeois. All right. So
I feel like he's just elaborating.
Yeah,
he's
it's
just
the same thing. Yeah.
Elaborating this thing that he's inconsistent of whether he's going to call the miser selfish in the ordinary sense or selfish in the sense of ascetic.
Since the book is not all of a piece, we have already had occasion, in connection with whimsy and political liberalism, to see how Stirner achieves the trick of transforming the bourgeois into non-egoists, chiefly owing to his great ignorance of real people and conditions. This same ignorance serves him here as a lever. Quoting at length from Stirner, this, Marx's interpolation, that is Stirner's fantasy about unselfishness, back to the quote, is repugnant to the stubborn brain of worldly man, but for thousands of years he has at least succumbed so far that he had to bend his obstinate neck and worship higher powers. The egoists, in the ordinary sense, behave half clerically and half in a worldly way. They serve both God and mammon. Right. So these egoists, in the ordinary sense, right, again, are the to think of themselves as altruistic, but they're not. They're not the Stirner's enlightened egoist. Right. So the enlightened egoist understands is that he's egoistic. That's one condition of it, and isn't in denial about it. But all right. So
Let me just get this straight, though, because it seems like Stirner wants to, on the one hand, condemn primitive egoism, and then, but the enlightened kind of egoism is what he's aiming for. So he, but then Marx says Stirner achieves the trick of transforming the bourgeois into non-egoists. In other words, he could just call them, as he apparently does sometimes, as just typical egoists, and maybe Marx would like him to leave him there, but Stirner seems to want to say these misers actually are egoistic in a more, and they can't be egoistic in the fully enlightened sense, so they have to be some sort of hybrid in between bastardization where their egoism and their apparent selflessness are hypocritically in conflict.
Yeah. What he seems to me to be saying
Okay.
is that the bourgeois are rationalizers and hypocrites, right? So they've rationalized their egoism, and it seems to them, at least in part, as unselfishness. And maybe Marx is suggesting it, when he calls that a fantasy, that they're more cynical and more comfortable with their actual selfishness and exploitativeness. I think maybe he thinks that's naive of Stirner to say that people in general rationalize it. This is reminiscent of Plato's "no man knowingly does evil" idea. The idea that we're always rationalizing our evil. I think maybe Marx doesn't think that's so much the case, perhaps, with the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, well, I see that, if you have this America first, it seems like we're talking the day after the inauguration, or very shortly after the inauguration, right? Yes, yesterday, such that you could see that as just a raw appeal to your self-interest. I'm going to, don't think that you need to be helping people around the world. Don't think that you need to be helping people who've been historically disenfranchised. It's all about you, and you are going to vote in your self-interest anyway, in the privacy of the ballot box. So I might as well just explicitly say, actually, that is expected and admirable, and there's nothing, anybody who would think anything else has a secret agenda. They're being selfish in some more nefarious way.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the mind of a nationalist for whom renaming the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America sounds like a good idea, who doesn't comprehend their own abject patheticness in wanting that to happen. There's a rare bit of political vitriol for me. What are they thinking? They're thinking that the America is great, and at least in disposition, and at least in potentiality, it's got to be great again, in the sense that that greatness has to be actualized because it's been undermined by others, by the bad part of society. And that greatness, right, includes power. It also includes prestige, as Orwell would point out, and the Gulf of America is on this prestige dimension of that. And we know, the group psychology element of that is they feel amplified and more powerful and prestigious by their identification with the United States and with Trump. But are they rationalizing that? I mean, obviously, I think Plato is right in the sense they think it's a righteous position and it's good, but it's also nakedly interested in power. And then the question is, well, how does that work? Orwell's claim is they're engaged in doublethink. They can think at the same time that power is good for its own sake. They can engage in this raw self-interest, but they can also rationalize it on the other side. That really is the essence of Orwell's doublethink. It can be the good. They can, on the one hand, say this is about the good, and on the other hand, tell themselves very transparently that it's about power. Which I think there's some insight. So I think it's quite, yeah, I think this is quite complicated psychologically. But it seems here that, yeah, Marx doesn't think that this interest in that the self-interest of the bourgeoisie is fully rationalized like that. They can be more petty in their self-interest, right? So the person who runs a factory, for instance, and is impoverishing his workers, do they have a rationalization for that? Do they think they're being selfless in some sense?
I think
Don't
yes.
they
I think
know on some level? They may, yeah, but don't they also
well,
know on some level that they're being exploitative, right? So,
no, they first identify their interest with the national interest, right? And
mhm.
they, according to Marx, they will argue for laws. We can't have, basically the system's going to fall apart if we provide worker protections, if we provide, shorten their hours, raise their pay, enforce profit sharing. Anything that's, the modern equivalent of that is anything like that. Anything that is a distraction from growth, is going to be terrible. It's going to lead to poor stock markets and inflation and all sorts of things we don't want. We got no time for sentimental scruples. We it's so or you could even lean into a utilitarian argument that, well, growth is what brings up everybody's standard of living in the long run. So instead of trying to keep kids from working at age 8 in conditions that there's a 20% chance that they're going to die, and they're definitely going to develop debilitating diseases from the conditions they're working in. Instead of that, let's benefit future generations. The utility calculation will work up so that growth. Eventually, kids won't be in that situation.
Yeah, I'm not as skeptical of the growth argument as you, because as your population expands, if your economy is not growing, your standard of living is actually going down. So you do expect the economy to grow at a certain rate, just to maintain. But right,
I agree. I
because you
agree with
have
the
new
growth
people
thing.
coming of age, and there's got to be new jobs for them essentially, or else.
Yes, I
It's
just
not
think
because it's not like the people are dying at the same rate as the population is expanding.
sure.
So
No, I just think that the idea that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can have multiple priorities, right? That's the issue. That's the whole issue with America First. People say America First, no foreign aid whatsoever. Like, well, you, the foreign aid is actually a very small part of the budget. Like, we could make a lot of difference over there by just giving up a little bit. No, no, no. We have to 100%. If all of your policies are not geared toward making my milk and eggs cheap and raising my particular standard of living, any little distraction from that is,
yeah,
is
I mean the
impermissible.
immigration thing is a good example of this because it right if we don't have the quotation is if we don't have a border we don't have a country or something like that. So it's very obviously about self-interest, and people understand it is about self-interest in the sense of the interest of their country. And it's not entirely rational, right? There should be border controls, but it's just this yo-yoing between, you know, probably a lack of border control or it was too low, and now it's just punitive and selfish and nasty. There is some reasonable compromise between self-interest and altruism. There is some policy that balances those things. But yeah, but the question is, what's going on in the mind of the of the person who thinks that, you need to stop letting refugees in the country, for instance, right? That I think is complicated. America is imperiled in one way or another. But so right, I'm bringing that up because I'm not sure how well someone like that understands their own mentality as selfish, and that really is what's at issue right
Sure.
now with Marx's critique of Stirner. I'm not sure what Marx thinks here yet. I mean, we've kind of speculated that he thinks it's less rationalized than Stirner seems to think it is. But I do think it's, my position is I don't fully understand it. Like, I think it's psychologically complicated.
Well, by saying America first, you're not explicitly saying me first. That is the
Right.
underlying theme is that, but it is me and people like me.
Mm-hmm.
It is that I want to be social. I want to have a community, but I, want them to be people that share my values. And, it's okay if you benefit them. And yeah, if one of them falls on hard times, well, that, for the grace of God, go I. But somebody who's fleeing an oppressive regime, like I would never be in that situation. So I don't have to, we should not afford them a single bit of our educational, our welfare, our dollars of any sense.
Yeah. There's a good place to leave that. I think we're out of time, actually.
We are out of time. I've been sort of paging ahead this section. As we know, this is a very sprawling work. And I feel like even just he keeps dwelling on the same point we've been discussing for many more pages. Like doing just even another 2 sections would not get us to the end of this section, and we would be talking about virtually the same thing next time that we're talking about this time. So I think we should take a little more time and see if we can skim ahead and see if there's like a different point.
Maybe we could skim ahead. On 264, he starts talking about communism.
Yeah, so even that, I saw that.
Incomprehensible to Max, yeah.
So that might be a fun addition, but let's review it maybe before next week and decide whether we want to do a part 2 to this or not. But I don't think we're going to continue, on this paragraph. So if you're interested, if we've sold the text to you, I encourage folks to get a hold of this themselves and check it out. Thanks for listening, everybody. Again, that's closereadsphilosophy.com, patreon.com/closereadsphilosophy, and leave us a nice rating and review. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.